Hello again. This one's going to be about the Black Panther. I went and saw it today, and I come from the point of view of being somewhat of a Marvel fan. I've seen pretty much all of the films. I'm not a fanboy, I would say, to the point where I also read all the comics and watch all the TV spin-offs on Netflix and whatnot. I'm not overly familiar with the comic book history behind each of the films that they've made. I have a slight awareness, but that's as far as it goes. So last year I watched the Marvel efforts, which were Spider-Man, I think, and Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and Thor Ragnarok, I think. All three of those were out in 2017, and I went to the cinema to see them all. At the time I was a little underwhelmed by all of them, really. I had quite decent expectations, and they fell a bit below or beneath them. I think out of the three, the general consensus towards Guardians 2 was probably the most in line with my thinking and thoughts on the film as a whole. Spider-Man, the general consensus seemed to be one of praise. I thought it was alright, I thought it was enjoyable, but I thought it was quite overrated, to be honest. And the final one of the year was Thor Ragnarok, which was enjoyable to me, but again, from my point of view, when compared to the general consensus, I was slightly underwhelmed by it, whereas the general consensus was that it was good or great or amazing. I thought it was okay. So Black Panther, it's there's been a lot of politicization around it, and it in a way has sort of put me off it to a certain degree. I was always going to see it because I'm a Marvel fan, but all the fanfare around it and the overhype and the inflated praise, it's just a bit silly. So my thoughts on it, I thought it was a good film. I thought it was well made. I thought the pacing was quite good. I thought the performances were good. For some it may have been a bit lengthy, but I think for me, given the themes that were in it and the plot and everything, I think the duration was okay. I didn't have an issue with that. Now, I have seen a few different reviews of it. Some reviews have been made from a fanboy perspective, and others have been somewhat political. And when I say political, more from the anti-SJW side of the political spectrum. So they were, I don't want to say tainted, but they had their own point of view, let's say. Anyway, I stupidly watched these reviews that included spoilers, so I went into this film knowing the full plot of the film and what would happen, so it wasn't fresh to me in terms of knowing exactly what was going to happen during the film. I went in beforehand knowing what was going to happen. Probably not a wise move on my part, but I couldn't really resist watching the reviews and the feedback on it. So, is it overrated? It's just a film, really. It's not perfect. It's not flawless. I wouldn't even say it's the best Marvel film. I'd probably say it's in the top, possibly the top 5. I do think it is better than the 3 films Marvel put out last year. For me, the main issue with the latest one that was released prior to Black Panther, which was Thor Ragnarok, was they put far too much comedy in it, and it was sometimes or quite frequently misplaced comedy, or not misplaced but mistimed parts in the film where there could have been a quite emotional impact or undertone or overtone even. They'd put in a gag that would just wipe that away, and they did it throughout the film, and for me that heavily marred it and brought it down from what it could have been. So I was worried about the amount of comedy that potentially might be in Black Panther. Thankfully, they have toned it down a lot, particularly from the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and Thor Ragnarok films. Spider-Man had bits of comedy, but it wasn't overkill so much like those two. And Black Panther was much more like that, probably to a lesser extent. The comedy was sort of minimal, really, and it had some quite heavy actions and occurrences in it. It was quite brutal in some ways, just some of the violence and some of the death. It was quite merciless, which is something you don't see a lot of in Marvel films, because they are somewhat directed to a younger audience, and they do get the child-friendly ratings to obviously maximize the earning capacity. So the Black Panther didn't overly compromise in terms of some of the violence and the graphic elements of the film. Thematically, it was quite heavy as well. It is quite Shakespearean in a lot of ways. It also reminded me of The Lion King. That's probably just the Africa thread running through it. A lot of the music and just some of the settings and the general storyline as a whole, in terms of it being set where it's set and it being about Prince becoming a king and people contesting the ruling of the country by that king, competitors to the throne, family betrayal, stuff like this. I won't go through a synopsis of the plot, partly because I don't want to leave out anything, but there's a lot of other videos for that where people can see it, and I imagine some of you watching have probably seen the film by now anyway, so I'll avoid going into detail what happens exactly at the end of the film, beginning and just throughout it. So no spoiler alerts required. But on the whole, yeah, it was a good film. I'd probably have to see it again before I could give it a ranking or a rating, but I do think it is one of the best Marvel films. And now let's get to the politicization of it. If you go into a film like this, well, any Marvel film really, especially the ones over the past year or so, depending on what film you're talking about specifically, the more Earth-based ones, they have obviously more Earth-based history and political topics and themes. So the three that were out last year, Guardians was obviously set not on Earth, so it wasn't really an issue in that film. Thor, again the same, so it wasn't really an issue. But for Spider-Man, it was an issue in terms of them being quite blunt and overt in their preaching. So there were a couple or maybe more lines or parts of the Spider-Man film where it's just blatant neo-Marxist progressivism / pure SJW ideology and preaching. The most obvious ones, the very opening scene with Michael Keaton, and he references something about playing cowboys and Indians as a kid, and his colleague says, oh, you can't really say that anymore, it's cowboys and Native Americans or something like that. And then there's another film where they go to, I think it's Washington DC, and there's a reference to one of the monuments, and one of the, I was going to say romantic interests, she kind of ends up being a potential romantic interest at the end of the film, MJ, who in this carnation of Spider-Man, they've cast as a mixed race girl, but the MJ character refuses to go into one of the monuments because it was built by slaves, and then her teacher kind of tries to correct her and says, no, it wasn't built by slaves. And then he turns, because he's not entirely sure, he's saying like it wasn't built by slaves, was it? And then he sort of half turns to, I think it's a black security guard, and the black security guard says, yeah, well, she's kind of right, it was built by slaves. So there's parts of the film that I like that, but on the whole, it wasn't too overbearing, and it didn't knock the film as a whole for me. But there's obviously bits like that throughout Black Panther. I'd say it is more subtle, possibly, than it was done throughout Spider-Man. So the instances in Black Panther, obviously the whole story in its entirety is somewhat political. I'll just give a brief description. It's a lot of the theme of the film is to do with isolationism and just maintaining a strong border, not diluting your culture, and it relates to borders and identity and just everything that's a hot topic right now. There's a lot of that implicit really throughout the film and throughout the storyline, but there's a few direct parts where that's kind of more directly touched on and referenced. Now the main villain, Killmonger, played by Michael B. Jordan, who is pretty good, his performance, but his whole angle in it is that he's pretty much an angry black man who has some identity issues and who lost his father at a young age. So that's his whole angle. He's very angry, and he basically wants to take revenge on those who he deems have somehow wronged him, and here's the neo-Marxist progressive angle, who he deems as the oppressor. Now there's parts of the film where, especially him, he states directly oppressor versus oppressed dichotomy of neo-Marxism, and other people reference it too, but it's more strongly pronounced through him, obviously because of his character and his character arc and everything to do with his upbringing and what happened to his father as a child, which I won't go into too much. But there's other little bits where Martin Freeman's character is jokingly, somewhat, maybe not, is referred to as colonizer rather than called his proper name, which the character that calls him that is, I think her name's Shuri in the film, the Black Panther's little smart-ass sister that makes everything and is portrayed as this tech genius. But when she meets him, she's fully aware of his name, but she calls him colonizer. That's obviously a reference to, well, everyone knows what that is a reference to. And there's just a few lines throughout the film where it's not so subtle in its white people are racist, white people are colonizers, we was Kangs type of rhetoric. Thankfully, it was far less than I feared it could be, and that's a good thing really. But as I said, it is an overall quite large part of the film and the feel and the themes of the film, purely based on its setting and whatnot. But it's a Marvel film that kind of stands on its own. It's probably the most different or unique film that they've made in terms of it not being anything like the others since probably the first Guardians of the Galaxy film. It has its own feeling, its own vibe, and it looks different, and it is different really to the rest. So it could be its own standalone movie, and I'd recommend people that have half an interest in it, even if you're not into other Marvel films and haven't seen them. It's not necessary to be up to speed on the full Marvel storyline so far to watch the film and enjoy it and know what's going on. You'll pretty much know everything that is going on within the film because, as I said, it's self-contained film for the most part. But if you have seen films like Captain America Civil War, for example, that's the film that directly predates this. So this film happens not long after the events of Civil War, maybe a week, a month after, but pretty soon after. So some of the flashbacks, for example, that you get are flashbacks of a scene or scenes from Captain America Civil War. But it's a good film. Yes, it is politicized. It does somewhat wear its political badge on its sleeve, somewhat. But for me, it wasn't to the extent where it was overbearing or off-putting. It was still enjoyable. I would recommend it, and I'm likely to see it again. I'm not sure yet. We'll see what happens. But regarding all the stuff with the Rotten Tomatoes score and the nearly universal praise from leftist film reviewers and journalists and commentators, just don't pay any attention to that, because that can sort of taint it, spoil it really. So if you're not aware of any of that nonsense, then all the better, just go into the film and kick back and enjoy a bit of escapism for hour 20 minutes or however long it is. For me, it was just a stepping stone really for the next film, Infinity War. I was looking forward to that more anyway, just because it's a culmination of everything up to this point with all of the Marvel films. Whereas, as I said, this one is more of a standalone. So it was sort of, in my eyes, an appetizer before the main course. I don't think the main course will be more typical superhero blockbuster fare. That is both a good and a bad thing, depending on your point of view. If you want to avoid the politicization and the identitarian themes of Black Panther, or at least surrounding Black Panther, then Infinity War will be a better film for you to just avoid all of that and just get lost in the escapism. I mean, it is fiction after all, it's not real, which is kind of ironic given some of the reactions to it. I'd recommend that you watch the Sargon of Akkad video on it. I'll put a link in the description, but that touches on it, and it also shows some of the views and statements of the cast members and some of the directors and whatnot, as well as some of the BuzzFeed type nonsense that is very contradictory, as with most far left things. It's okay when applied to one group, but not okay when applied to another group. What I'm referring to here is ethno-nationalism. The BuzzFeed tweet goes on about it being a black film for black people, a black country, looking out for black interests, blah, blah, blah. Lots of racial identitarian collectivism. But then painting it as a positive when directed towards or about black people, yet regarding white identitarianism, it's just the same people that are gonna instantly shout that down as racist, but when it's done for black people, it's somehow not racist. Just the usual hypocrisy from neo-Marxist progressives. But yes, it's worth seeing and I'd recommend it.